What is going on, my young Padawans? Today I will talk to you all about plant taxonomy. And what in the world is plant taxonomy, you might be asking? Well, I'll make it simple. Taxonomy is how are we going to categorize plants, and more importantly, how will we ID them? Okay, so for starters, around 450 million years ago, the first true plants emerged, and the fossil record shows this. Those would be the mosses. So they showed up along shorelines because they probably evolved from things like green algae. And you see mosses along the shorelines, and they're kind of simple and not all too complex. And little by little, these ferns started appearing. Okay, ferns are relatively simple too, but for a while throughout Earth's history, they were really diverse and dominant plants. So I wanted to show you some here. This one is a maidenhair fern. Maidenhair ferns, I think, are really gorgeous. They are native to the Texas Hill Country. This one was collected on the cliffs along the Guadalupe River. Right next to this one, I have a Boston fern. This has a ridiculous name because contrary to what you might think, Boston ferns come from Mexico. So there you have it. There you have the simple plants, the mosses, and of course I mentioned the ferns. But eventually plants were like, hey, yo, we want to start throwing our pollen in the air. We want to have a better way of reproducing. So that leads us to the Gymnosperms, okay? And let me kind of zoom in here a little bit for you. These are two plants that I've shown you in previous videos. You see the ash juniper on the right and the bald cypress on the left. And you'll notice they have things on their leaves that look a little bit like pine needles. So yes, there is a specific type of gymnosperm called a conifer. So gymnosperms can be further divided into conifers as one example. And a little hint here, just think pine cone, conifers. All right. The one on top is a ponderosa pine. Ponderosas are found in the mountains of West Texas and then further into the southern Rockies. And beneath that one is a loblolly pine. Loblolly pines are not so much found in San Antonio, but they are sort of kind of native. You can find tons of loblolly pines on the way to Houston and further into East Texas. Here is another gymnosperm. This one's kind of an odd one. This is called a cycad. This particular species is not native to Texas. This one came from Japan. But people plant this type of cycad in their yard here, and it does quite well. So what do we have so far? We had the mosses and the ferns, and then we have the gymnosperms, which are wind pollinated, and they cause all sorts of allergies. And your weatherman gets the words mixed up. You know, it's an ash juniper one day, it's a mountain cedar the next. But there you have gymnosperms. So along the way, the next group of plants showed up in the fossil record, and they were like, hey, yo, we want to make plant reproduction even more efficient. So the next group of plants would be called the angiosperms. Angiosperms, if you want the silly little kid word, those are the flowering plants. So like I said, boys, they made plant reproduction even more efficient because they made flowers, which are fragrant and showy and colorful and attract pollinators. Y'all like bees and butterflies. So instead of blowing the pollen in the air and giving us allergies, these guys and girls, whatever you want to call them, they rely on a little helper to partake in plant reproduction. So let's further categorize the angiosperms. Here we have the monocots. Monocots, first off, have these stalks that come out of the middle, big flowering stalks. So you can think of an aloe vera or a century plant, even corn. When you see a field of corn, each of those stalks was a flower at one time. This airplane plant here, I know this isn't the best example, but this was a flowering stalk as well. And there's the little flower, airplane plant. So that's one way of trying to interpret what makes a monocot. But you want the silliest and easy way, perhaps of all. They have blades for leaves. There's an areca palm, blade. Airplane plant, blade. Aloe vera, blade. Okay? And perhaps the easiest way of interpreting this in all is that stuff that you mow in your yard once in a while. It's called, you guessed it, grass, blades, monocots. Bam. Now check this out. These blades, these specialized leaves that I'm calling blades, you'll see those little lines, okay? Those lines are the veins. That's the vascular tissue. That's where the water, and, specifically the xylem is carrying the water along, okay? So if you can see these lines side by side, that's called parallel venation. So how do we distinguish what makes a monocot? One more time, y'all. We've got blades, we've got flowering stalks, and we've got parallel venation. Now we get to the dicots. They have something called net venation. So if you look here, instead of having those veins side by side running parallel to each other, this looks more like, crow's feet or something. Okay, so that's why it's called net venation. All right. So a prickly pear cactus is actually an example of a dicot. And you're like, huh? The aloe vera is a succulent, and it's got prickly thingies, and it lives in the desert. Doesn't that do the same thing? Well, yeah, y'all. That's called convergent evolution. They've evolved in similar habitats to have similar features, but guess what? They are not related. A prickly pear cactus, if you've ever seen them in bloom, and maybe in class I can show you one of these days, they do not have flowering stalks. Okay? So there you have it. Dicots, monocots. Now, something I want to touch on real quick, okay? This is important. The most successful groups of plants ever in terms of biological diversity are dicots. Most plants that come to your mind, again, in terms of species, everything from live oak trees to rose bushes to your own Texas bluebonnet and many, many millions of others are dicots. So again, biological diversity, dicot. But just in terms of sheer numbers or density, monocots. And have you guessed why? I kind of gave you a hint earlier. Think about grass. You might have one oak tree in your yard surrounded by like billions of blades of grass. So in terms of just number, monocot. But in terms of biological diversity, not even close, y'all. Not even close. The most successful plants of all time would have to be the dicots. All right, we cool there? Let's move on real quick because I want to speed this thing up. All right. Suppose you're trying to describe your girlfriend. You wouldn't just say she's pretty. I mean, you have to have something a little bit more definitive so that someone could find her in a crowd. Does that make sense? You would say she's blonde, or she has glasses, or she's 5'2", or she has freckles, or she has blue eyes, whatever. You get what I'm saying, right? So it's kind of the same thing when you're trying to ID plants. There are certain vocabulary terms that will help you. It's like saying the plants, it's like if you just said a plant is 4 foot tall and green, that doesn't mean anything. Like most plants are 4 foot tall and green. You get my point? All right, so here we go. Take a look at this red oak, and there's frostweed, and there's a Mustang grapevine. You'll notice that these have little ridges all along the leaves. Those ridges are called teeth. Yes, that's a dumb word, but get over it. They're called teeth. So if a plant has little ridges, anything from an oak to a frostweed to a grapevine, if it has teeth, you would say it has a dentate margin. Okay, so that's like saying my girlfriend's brunette or she's blonde or whatever. It's dentate. Now we're getting somewhere. Now you have something that's a little bit more definitive, okay? Or you could say, like in this case, this red bud leaf has no teeth. It has no ridges. So you would say, oh, the red bud is entire. So ridges, dentate. No ridges, entire. So now you just have two terms to help you describe your plant, your tree, whatever the case is. Okay? Okay. Now you can also say, well, look at this Texas mountain laurel, which, by the way, that was another tree I talked about in a previous video. With the mountain laurel, this whole thing is one leaf. And each of the little doohickeys on there is a leaflet. So if you have a bunch of leaflets that make up the one leaf, that's called a compound leaf. Similarly, this mimosa, like each of these, I know I'm trying, there you go, each of those is also a leaf made up of teeny tiny little bitty leaflets. Does that make sense? So all the leaflets together make up one leaf. That's a bigger example and it's easier to see. So how do you ID plants? You can say, it's simple, it's compound. So like, again, this red bud, for example, would be entire and simple. You see? It has no, it's one big leaf. It's simple. It has no teeth. It's entire. All right? Whereas this mountain laurel is compound. All right? This frostweed is dentate. All right? And last but certainly not least, I wanted to make this really clear. What makes angiosperms so much more successful than, I'm kind of Blair Witching you around. Look at that. These guys, or rather these girls, you know, the pollen's getting blown around all over the place. You know what I'm saying, y'all? That's not very efficient. All that does is cause us to get a lot of allergies. But moving along, look at this. And these are just a few Texas natives. That's a Mexican hat. You've got the blanket flower. You've got a real pretty early spring bloomer called a wine cup. Look at that, Coreopsis. It looks like a little miniature sunflower. And one of my favorite found in the Texas Hill Country, it's called Mountain Pink. These are beautiful. And you know what? Insects actually see more colors than we do. So that's beautiful to me. Imagine what it looks like to a bee or a butterfly. You know what I'm saying? It's also fragrant. So these are, like I said earlier, these wildflowers, and of course trees have wildflowers as well. They are attracting, you guessed it, they're attracting the pollinators to transport the pollen and make the act of plant reproduction a whole lot more efficient. Lastly but not least, check this out. That's the fruit of a magnolia. Does that look like a fruit to you? If I say fruit, you probably think of an apple or an orange or peach, whatever, right? Right? You know what I'm saying? And the whole point of making a fruit that's edible is for the animal to eat that fruit and you pass along the seeds elsewhere. Well, this magnolia, let me pick it up again just because it's cool. That magnolia, it's kind of like a living fossil. These things are way back when in the fossil record. And that fruit looks less like a fruit as you think of it and perhaps a little bit more like its distant relatives. I'm trying to reach for it. The pines, the Gymnosperms. Does that make sense? That's why it's a living fossil. It's a living fossil. That's why. Because the idea of evolving to make a tasty fruit to get your herbivores to pass the seeds along, that aspect, that strategy as far as evolution goes, wasn't around yet. That's why this has been around so long, but it's still beautiful. It's a beautiful, big, huge white flower. You find them in places like Louisiana, all right? So God bless you guys. Thanks for watching. Thanks for sticking it out. But I guess you have no choice because you have, classwork and stuff. I love you guys. Have a great one. See you later. Bye-bye.